Welcome, friends, and let me tell you a story of family, betrayal, unlikely friendship, and the final act of love of a wonderful woman. Enjoy the story. Margaret Wilson sat in stunned disbelief as her daughter-in-law Amber paced around the living room, her shrill voice echoing off the walls. Look, Margaret, let's be real here. You're not getting any younger, and I don't want to deal with all the paperwork and hassle after you kick the bucket. Just sign the damn house over to me now and make it easy on both of us. Margaret felt rage boiling up inside her. The audacity of this woman. After everything Margaret had done for her. She fixed Amber with an icy stare. Now you listen here, Missy. At your age, you should be settled down, not still traipsing around town looking for attention from any man who so much as glances your way. I'll be dead before I let you get your claws on my house. Amber let out a harsh laugh, tossing her bleached blonde hair over her shoulder. Oh, please. My life is just beginning. You think I enjoyed being shackled to your loser son for all those years before he finally offed himself? And don't even get me started on that good-for-nothing grandson of yours. He'd blow through any inheritance money in a day, tops. Margaret couldn't exactly disagree with Amber's assessment of her grandson Blake. The boy was the spitting image of Amber. Not just in looks, but in character. Not an ounce of responsibility or work ethic in him. Margaret's thoughts drifted back to when Amber first waltzed into their lives on the arm of Margaret's son James. Margaret had hoped it was just a phase, that her son would wise up and find himself a nice, respectable girl to settle down with. But as the years went by, it became painfully clear that Amber was here to stay. Amber continued her carefree party girl lifestyle, while James worked himself to the bone to support her frivolous spending habits. When he finally put his foot down and told Amber it was time to grow up and start a family, she reluctantly agreed. 9 months later, Blake arrived, but it didn't take long for Margaret to realize she'd be the one raising him. As Blake grew up, James finally reached his breaking point. He gave Amber an ultimatum, shape up or ship out, but by then, it was too late. They were like 3 strangers living under the same roof. James threw himself into his work, staying later and later at the office, until one rainy night 2 years ago, when Margaret got the call she'd been dreading. James had wrapped his car around a tree, killing him instantly. To this day, Margaret suspected it was no accident. Her son must have decided that a quick death was better than the slow torture of living with Amber. Now, 2 years after James's death, here was Amber, brazenly claiming what she felt entitled to. She had wasted no time divvying up the assets with Blake, who promptly skipped town to blow his share. Meanwhile, Amber frittered away her portion on trips, clothes, and who knows what else. And now she had the nerve to demand that Margaret sign over her beloved house and move into that rundown old shack Pops had left her. Amber was still prattling on. I mean, it's the least you could do. We're family after all. And it's not like you'll need this big house much longer, what with you being sick and all. Margaret's blood ran cold. How could Amber possibly know about her illness? She had been so careful to hide it from everyone. The doctors said she only had a few months left, a year at most, but Margaret was determined to spend her final days in the home she and her dear Henry had built together. She looked Amber straight in the eye. I don't know how you found out about my condition, but let's get one thing clear. I will never sign this house over to you. I'm not going anywhere, and don't think for a second that you or that no-account grandson of yours will get your grubby paws on a single cent of my money after I'm gone. Amber's face twisted into an ugly sneer for a moment, before morphing back into a saccharine smile. Well, I'm sorry you feel that way, Margaret. I was just trying to help. You know, I've been having a tough time lately, trying to get back on my feet. I don't suppose you'd let me stay in the guest room for a bit while I sort things out. Against her better judgment, Margaret reluctantly agreed, but she regretted it almost immediately. That very night, Amber had a rowdy crowd of her low-life friends over. Their raucous laughter and thumping music blared through the thin walls until the wee hours of the morning. When Margaret tried to confront Amber about it the next day, she was met with a cold, hard stare. Listen up, old woman, Amber sneered. We both know you'll be worm food soon enough. So why don't you just sit back and savor your last few days in peace? Hell, You should be grateful you get to die nice and comfy in your own bed. A lot of folks don't get that luxury, you know." Margaret recoiled as if she'd been slapped. She knew Amber resented her, but she was taken aback by the pure malice dripping from her words. In the following days, Margaret noticed a suspicious man coming around, visiting Amber at odd hours. He had a cruel, hungry look in his eyes that made Margaret's skin crawl. She started barricading her bedroom door at night, an unsettled feeling growing in the pit of her stomach. Then, late one evening, Margaret overheard a heated conversation between Amber and the menacing stranger. She crept closer, straining to make out the words. "I need more time," Amber was saying in a pleading tone. "I'm working on getting the money, I swear." "Time's up, sweetheart," the man growled. "You better pay up or else. That old bat might have an unfortunate accident, if you know what I mean. Get you that inheritance money real quick." Ice flooded Margaret's veins. Dear God, they were planning to kill her. With shaking hands, she gathered up her important documents and a few cherished mementos. Tears streamed down her weathered cheeks as she fled out into the night, leaving behind the only home she'd ever known. Sarah Johnson sighed heavily as she cruised down the dark streets, the beams from her taxi's headlights cutting through the misty night. It had been one hell of a day. Her youngest, Sammy, had come down with a nasty case of strep. Then the school had called to inform her that Tommy, her eldest, was failing math. She tried her best, she really did. But raising two young sons alone was no easy feat, especially after the way that snake Mark had done her wrong. Sarah felt like a fool every time she thought about how she'd fallen for his empty promises. "Baby, just hear me out," Mark had said, his voice dripping with false sincerity. "Sell that little house your grandma left you. We can invest that money in my startup, and we'll be living the high life in no time." Sarah had been hesitant, but Mark had a way of making everything sound so simple, so right. So she'd signed the papers, the ink barely dry, before Mark started spending her money hand over fist. New car, new suits, trips to Vegas for business. Sarah told herself it would all be worth it. That is, until she discovered that Mark had put everything in his own name. "It's not that I don't trust you, baby, but I gotta protect my income, you know? Getting married, it just complicates things," he'd said. Even after Tommy was born, Mark still wouldn't put a ring on it. When Sarah got pregnant again, she was sure he'd finally come around. But shortly after Sammy arrived, Mark sat her down with a somber expression. "I've met someone, Sarah. She understands my lifestyle. Trying to be a family man, it's just not me. I think it's best for everyone if you and the boys find your own place." Sarah couldn't believe what she was hearing. Rage and despair warred within her. "So help me God, Mark, you better pay child support or I'll—" "You'll what?" he sneered. "Take me to court? Think long and hard about that, baby. My lawyers will paint you as an unfit mother faster than you can blink. You'll be lucky to get supervised visitation. Just walk away. You and the Rugrats ain't my problem no more." So Sarah had gathered up her babies and what little dignity she had left. She'd bounced around from one dingy apartment to the next, working whatever job she could scrounge up, which is how she'd ended up behind the wheel of this cab on a rainy night. Sarah snapped out of her bitter reverie when she noticed a figure stumbling along the side of the road. As she slowed down, her headlights illuminated the face of a frightened elderly woman. Sarah pulled over and hopped out. "Ma'am, are you all right? Do you need some help?" The woman blinked up at her, eyes wide and glassy with shock. I need to call a taxi." "Well, you're in luck," Sarah said gently. "I'm a taxi driver. Why don't you hop in and I'll take you wherever you need to go? No charge." As they drove, Sarah listened patiently while Margaret poured out her story. When she got to the part about her greedy daughter-in-law trying to scam her out of her house, Sarah felt a surge of anger on the poor woman's behalf. "It just ain't right," she said, shaking her head. "You worked hard for what you got. For your own flesh and blood to try and take it from you, that's lower than low." Margaret sighed wearily. "I just want to live out my days in peace. That's why I'm headed to Golden Acres Nursing Home. I hear it's a nice place. Quiet. I think I'll be happy there." Tears pricked at the corners of Sarah's eyes. She reached over and patted the woman's hand. "Don't you worry now, Miss Margaret. You're going to be just fine. I'll get you to that nursing home safe and sound. I promise you that. True to her word, Sarah helped Margaret get settled in at Golden Acres. Over the next few weeks, she visited often, bringing small comforts to brighten the woman's days. Margaret would clasp Sarah's hand, her eyes full of gratitude. "You're an angel, Sarah. A pure living angel. I don't know what I'd do without you, truly I don't." Then one day, Sarah arrived to find Margaret's room empty. Fearing the worst, she rushed to the nurse's station. "Miss Margaret, is she—" Sarah couldn't bring herself to say the words. The nurse gave her a sympathetic look. She passed on during the night, went peacefully in her sleep. Bless her heart. "I'm so sorry. I know you two were close." Sarah stumbled out of the nursing home, vision blurred with tears. In the short time she'd known her, Margaret had become like family. And now she was gone, just like everyone else Sarah had ever cared about. 2 months later, Sarah was enjoying a rare day off. The cab company had had a good week, and her tips had been generous. She'd even managed to swing some back-to-school clothes for the boys. Tommy and Sammy were thrilled with their new sneakers, and Sarah felt a sense of pride at providing for her babies. She was just putting a casserole in the oven when there was a knock at the door. Tommy went to answer it, then came running back with an excited look on his face. "Mom, there's a man here. Says he's a lawyer and he needs to talk to you." Puzzled, Sarah wiped her hands on a dish towel and went to see what the fuss was about. A distinguished older gentleman stood in the doorway, briefcase in hand. "Miss Sarah Johnson, my name is Everett Barlow. I'm an attorney representing the estate of Margaret Wilson. May I come in?" Numbly, Sarah stepped aside to let him enter. When they were seated at the kitchen table, Mr. Barlow cleared his throat and began to speak. "Miss Johnson, I'm here today because you're named as the sole beneficiary in Mrs. Wilson's last will and testament." Sarah gaped at him in disbelief. I don't understand. Margaret and I were friends, but what do you mean sole beneficiary?" Mr. Barlow smiled kindly. "Shortly after you helped her move into Golden Acres, Mrs. Wilson had her will amended. She was quite emphatic that you were to inherit her entire estate. The house, the savings, all of it. She wanted me to give you this letter." With trembling fingers, Sarah unfolded the crisp stationery. Tears began to flow freely as she read Margaret's words. "Dearest Sarah, if you're reading this, it means the Lord has called me home. I hope He saw fit to let me go quick and quiet. But there's some things I need to say to you before I depart this world. In my darkest hour, when my own family had turned against me, you were there. A beacon of pure goodness and light. You asked for nothing, but gave me everything. Your friendship, your time, most of all your love. That's why I'm leaving you the house. It's not much, but it's a good home. A place to raise those sweet boys of yours. I only wish I could see the looks on their faces when you tell them they'll have their own rooms. This isn't charity, so don't even think it. You've more than earned it. You saved me, Sarah, in more ways than you'll ever know. I'll be watching over you from heaven. Live well and be happy. All my love, Margaret." Sarah pressed the letter to her heart, overcome. Even from beyond the grave, Margaret had found a way to take care of her. The day of the will reading, Sarah stood nervously outside the lawyer's office. She still hadn't fully absorbed the enormity of Margaret's final gift. Lost in thought, she didn't notice Amber storming up until the woman was right in her face. "You conniving little bitch!" Amber screeched. "You think you can just swoop in and steal what's rightfully mine? I'll see you in court. I'll tie this up for years." She lunged at Sarah, hands curved into claws, but Mr. Barlow stepped between them. "Mrs. Hanson, I'll remind you that the terms of the will are ironclad. You have no legal claim to Mrs. Wilson's estate. I suggest you leave now, before I'm forced to call security." Amber sputtered with rage, but finally spun on her heel and flounced out. Sarah turned to Mr. Barlow, eyes wide. "I can't thank you enough for your help. Truly, I don't know what I would have done." The lawyer patted her shoulder, a twinkle in his eye. "No need for thanks, but I am curious. What do you plan to do now that you've come into this windfall?" Sarah thought for a moment. "Well, first thing, I'm going to quit my job at the cab company. It's too dangerous, and my boys need me around more. I'd like to go back to school, finish my degree, maybe start a little business out of the house, like I always dreamed about." Mr. Barlow nodded. All fine ideas. You know, I have some connections at the university. I'd be more than happy to make some calls, see about getting you enrolled for next semester. I couldn't possibly impose, Sarah began, but the lawyer waved away her protest. Nonsense. It would be my pleasure. Besides, I made a promise to Margaret that I'd look after you, and I always keep my promises. Something in his tone made Sarah's heart flutter. She suddenly realized how attractive he was, with his salt and pepper hair and warm brown eyes. Honestly, he wasn't much older than she was, and he'd been so kind to her during this whole process. Flushing, she pushed away the thought. She needed to focus on her family right now. Speaking of which, she couldn't wait to tell the boys the good news. With the help of the movers Mr. Barlow had recommended, they'd be settling into their new home in no time. As she walked to her car, Sarah tipped her face up to the bright blue sky. Thank you, she whispered. She knew Margaret was up there smiling down on her. She could almost hear the woman's raspy chuckle. You just proved me right, kid. You deserve every good thing coming to you. Now go on, get home to those babies, and tell that nice attorney not to be a stranger. Sarah laughed softly, shaking her head. It was almost as if Margaret had known what the future held. But then again, maybe she had. After all, the old gal had been full of surprises right up to the very end. One thing was for sure. Sarah would never forget her. And every time she stepped through the door of their beautiful new home, she would think of the unlikely angel who had changed her life, her kids' lives. Margaret had been so much more than a friend. She had been a guardian angel, watching over Sarah and her family, even from beyond the grave. And as Sarah drove home, her heart full of hope and gratitude, she knew that Margaret's legacy would live on through her and her children. The move to Margaret's house went smoothly, thanks to Mr. Barlow's assistance. Sarah and the boys spent the weekend exploring their new home, marveling at the spacious rooms and beautiful backyard. Tommy and Sammy were thrilled to have their own bedrooms for the first time in their lives. On Sunday evening, as Sarah was preparing dinner in the well-appointed kitchen, the doorbell rang. She wiped her hands on a dish towel and went to answer it, surprised to find Mr. Barlow standing on the porch, a bouquet of flowers in hand. Everett, what a pleasant surprise. Please come in. Sarah stepped aside to let him enter, her heart fluttering at the sight of his smile. I hope I'm not interrupting, he said, handing her the flowers. I just wanted to stop by and see how you were settling in. Sarah accepted the bouquet with a blush. We're doing wonderfully thanks to you. I can't tell you how much I appreciate all your help. Would you like to stay for dinner? It's the least I can do. Everett's eyes lit up. I'd be delighted. As they sat around the dining table, Sarah couldn't help but marvel at how right it felt to have Everett there with her family. The boys took to him immediately, peppering him with questions about his job and hobbies. After dinner, as Sarah walked Everett to the door, he turned to her with a serious expression. Sarah, I've been thinking. I know you've been through a lot, and the last thing you need is more complications in your life, but I can't deny my feelings for you any longer. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Everett, He took her hand in his. I understand if you're not ready, but I want you to know that I care for you deeply, and when you're ready, I'll be here, for you and the boys. Tears sprang to Sarah's eyes. She had never dared to hope for a love like this, a love that encompassed not just her, but her children as well. I care for you too, Everett, and I think I'm ready to take a chance on happiness again. He pulled her into a warm embrace, and Sarah felt a sense of peace wash over her. For the first time in years, she knew everything was going to be all right. 1 year later, Sarah stood in the backyard of the house that had once belonged to Margaret, watching with a full heart as Tommy and Sammy played catch with Everett. The past year had been filled with more joy than Sarah had ever thought possible. True to his word, Everett had helped her enroll in college, where she was now studying business management. He had also encouraged her to start a small catering company out of her home, which had quickly gained a loyal following in the community. But more than that, he had become a true partner to Sarah and a loving father figure to her boys. Just last month, he had surprised her with a ring and a heartfelt proposal, which she had tearfully accepted. As the sun began to set, Sarah looked up at the sky, sending a silent prayer of thanks to Margaret. "You were right, my friend," she whispered. "Life has a way of working out, even when all seems lost. Thank you for being my angel. Thank you for bringing love back into my life." And somewhere, in a place beyond the cares of the world, Margaret smiled down on the little family she had brought together. Her final act of love and kindness had created a legacy of hope that would endure for generations to come.